This program is a presentation of Eye on Education, a partnership of WGBH and the Boston Globe with WILD 1090 AM and El Mundo newspaper. Major funding for WGBH's Eye on Education is provided by the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. For more information, visit the Eye on Education website at wgbh.org/eyeoneducation.
Welcome to a Basic Black special for Eye on Education. I'm Howard Manley, and tonight we bring you Beyond Black and White, Race in the Boston Public Schools. 25 years ago, discussions about the city's racial issues in the schools were usually limited to black and white. But today, Boston has a growing Asian and Latino population, and everywhere there is talk of a majority-minority city. Nowhere are these changes more apparent than in the public school system, where students of color account for 85% of the population. Joining us to discuss the impact of these changes are Charles Ogletree, author and professor of Harvard Law School, Gary Orfield from the Civil Rights Project at Harvard University, Dr. Thomas Payson, superintendent of the Boston Public Schools, and Melissa Colon with Initiativa, the Massachusetts Educational Initiative for Latino students. Our studio audience is comprised of teachers, parents, students, and activists. Welcome to all of you. It's important to note that the issue of race is not new to the Boston Public Schools. As we'll see in this short historical clip, the goals of a quality education and equal resources have always been the motivating factors for change.
Race has been an issue in the Boston Public Schools since the 19th century. In 1845, with the support of Boston's free black community, Benjamin Roberts filed a lawsuit for the right to send his daughter Sarah to a white school. Boston had a school for black students, but it was severely overcrowded and underfunded.
The Smith School got approximately 1/3 of the funding that the average white school got, and so this took its toll on the building itself, the upkeep of the building, on paying for quality teachers, and it also took its toll on being able to buy books, the latest equipment.
In Boston, separate did not mean equal.
Roberts versus the City of Boston was the seminal case that basically brought integration of the Boston public schools to the forefront in the state of Massachusetts. At the time, Boston was the only city in Massachusetts that still had segregated school systems.
But in 1850, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruled against Benjamin Roberts, affirming the constitutionality of separate but equal in the Boston public schools. The Roberts ruling would stand for the next 100 years. It wasn't until 1954 that the United States Supreme Court struck down the notion of separate but equal in the now famous Brown versus Board of Education decision. But in Boston, the Brown decision had little practical effect. Students attended neighborhood schools, and the city's neighborhoods were increasingly segregated.
You're starting to see certain sections of the city becoming increasingly black, if not majority black. Then you're starting to see the elementary schools and the middle schools serving those communities becoming increasingly black and perhaps a majority black.
In 1974, in response to the continuing segregation in the Boston schools, the U.S. District Court of Massachusetts ordered Boston to use busing as a way to integrate the system.
Once you start to see the beginnings of school desegregation in Boston in 1974 and 1975, the national images flashed upon television screens or also pictures in newspapers allowed many people to perhaps look at the city of Boston differently.
Violence over busing traumatized the city. Many white students left the school system. In 1999, after 25 years, Boston abandoned the busing program. A school system overwhelmingly comprised of students of color adopted a race-neutral school assignment plan.
If we think of the fact that it's really only in the last 40 years, 50 years, that America has actually had any kind of idea that schools need to be integrated. That's not enough time to say it's not working, throw up our hands. Historically, segregated schools have not done as well of a job of educating African American students.
Today, the issue of race in the Boston public schools has moved beyond black and white. 46% of the students are black, 31% are Latino, and 9% are Asian. The schools reflect the city's majority-minority population.
It's amazing to see that 150 years from 1849 all the way up until 2005, that the same struggles and the same issues are still being fought and that they're still being argued.
I'd like to get each of our panelists to answer this question, but I'll start with Professor Ogletree. As we've seen from the clip, the issue of race has been swirling around since the beginning. Why is that?
Well, it's interesting. W.B. Du Bois, one of the greatest and most brilliant minds ever, was educated here at Harvard in the late 1800s. And in 1903, he said the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He recognized it 100 years ago, the problem of race. 1935, he said, Negroes don't need segregated schools or mixed schools. They need education. So that's been the challenge, quality education for everyone. That's what Brown called for. That's what we sought. The problem has been incredible political, and I would say race resistance to quality education. Political in terms of judges and politicians. Race in terms of whites really not feeling comfortable in going to school in the same classroom with black children. That's the tragedy of this country and tragedy of the city. And it still is a persistent problem. We see white flight, black middle class flight, and the re-segregation of our public schools, even though the laws have changed, outlawing actual segregation as an explanation for it.
Dr. Orfield, you've done an incredible amount of research on this topic. How have you seen history and race relations impact public education?
Well, what happened was that it took 20 years after the Brown decision before anything was done about segregation outside the South. And all the northern cities were very segregated. By the time the decisions came down in Boston and other places, we already had tremendous suburbanization of the middle class. Most of the white middle class was out in the suburbs. And the Supreme Court in 1974 limited desegregation to within a city boundary under most circumstances. So Boston today has only 8% of the students in the metropolitan area and only 2% of the white students. Not including the entire area, which is one of the whitest metropolitan areas in the United States, in thinking about how to solve this problem, has meant that we've had very limited area and limited space, and the federal courts are now under control of judges that basically do not support active integration and have been restraining things like the Boston Latin desegregation plan. Are pushing us backwards. What we really need to do is look at the good experiences in Metro Boston, places like Cambridge and Lynn and other places, which have had really successful desegregation in many respects, and where the students overwhelmingly support it, and see if we can't figure out how to do something about this beyond just the boundaries of Boston with programs like Metco.
Dr. Pazon, I mean, obviously you've inherited these historic problems. How do you see that on a day-to-day basis on your job?
Well, I think it's really interesting that when we think of history and we think of the role of public education in America, that the schools, aside from the military, have been the institution that have been asked to take on probably the most important social issue dealing with race in the 20th century. And we've seen the courts play an unusual role, and there's been a pendulum swing with respect to what's happened. So that has put the schools in a very difficult position. I would argue without the expertise to deal with all of the race-related issues that are grounded in the larger community in the 6.5-hour day school day. Now, I don't think that we can ignore our history. We have to learn from it, but we've got to frame the question around race in the schools in the context of today. And diversity is the issue today. Diversity is wonderful. It's a positive value, a positive situation. So it's no longer a question of black and white in Boston. It's a question of a more diverse student population, Latino, Asian, and within every major racial group, there is increasing diversity.
That's an excellent point. And if you look back 100 years ago and even 50 years ago, Latino students, for example, were not even part of the equation. I'm going to make you an honorary doctor today, Dr. Colon. How do you sort of view the historic patterns of?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's for the Latino community. Lately, we've been getting a lot of attention because of the recent changes in the census. However, it is important to know that there has been a Latino community in Boston and in surrounding communities for close to 50, 60 years. I'm an example of that. I'm a second-generation Latina who's been educated in the public school system. With that said, I think that a lot of times Latinos are put in the middle between the white experience and the African-American experience. And the conversation in many of the community agencies that we work with is not solely focused on race, but on quality of education. And we, as a community that's very multiracial, do value diversity and feel that it is an important part of children's education. But that quality seems to be the topic of conversation. And how is it that we ensure that all of our children are receiving a high-quality education in a minority-majority district, which Boston Public Schools is?
Can I just say a word about that, Howard? It's very interesting because Ms. Colon is right, but even looking historically, I blame our courts. The group that really started this idea of quality education and diversity were Hispanics in California. The Mendez case in 1946 was before Brown. Brown, Thurgood Marshall supported that, but there's an effort way back in the 40s saying, wait a minute, why are the Chicanos in Southern California going to inferior schools to whites? We pay the same taxes, we live in the same community, why are we getting a different education? And our Supreme Court for a long time defined those who happen to be of Hispanic descent as white. Mm-hmm. Those who happen to be of Asian descent as black, as if there was only black and white. You either fit in this category or you didn't. And I think when the court can't unravel these things and sort it out, how can politicians and people understand some of the problems? And I think it leads to a complexity we have now about what does race mean, how does race matter, and it's one of the problems we have.
Right. About the quality issue and the segregation issue, they're related in powerful ways. The reason why there was so much struggle over this issue is because whites got better schools. Right. And they still get better schools. In Metro Boston today, 97% of the highly segregated black and Latino schools have concentrated poverty. They have less qualified teachers, more non-certified teachers. They have lower test scores, lower levels of competition, lower rates of going to college, higher dropout rates. All of these things are related to the segregation. If segregation wasn't related to anything else, it wouldn't matter so much, but it happens to be related to everything. That's what the Thurgood Marshall and the other black lawyers who brought the Brown case understood, because they tried to equalize a long time before they tried to bring down the racial boundaries.
Well, let me ask you, or at least pose this question. Does history get in the way of modern-day discussions about improving public education?
I grew up here. I left in the middle 60s before the experience of the 70s, came back in October of 1995. And it's a different place, and yet there's a constant tension in Boston between viewing the issues around race and quality education and thinking about educating all children to high standards, no excuses, welcome whoever comes in the schoolhouse door, and this context of the bad experience that started back in the late 60s, early 70s. And that's the big frustration, because the diversity within the black community is quite different from what it was 30 years ago in the Latino community, in the Asian community, in the white community. So we've got to get beyond using the reference point of busing in Boston as the factor that initiates or sets the context for every conversation, and move to the conversation, are we going to educate all kids, provide the resources necessary to do so, and do it in a diverse setting which we cherish and celebrate and aren't afraid of?
If I could, one of the things, I do agree with that, but I do think it's important, especially for the newcomer Latino community, the families, to be informed about the history and the legacy of Boston Public Schools. A lot of my work in the past year has focused with working with immigrant communities that were not necessarily aware of busing and the history of segregation and the civil rights movement. And it is important for the Latino community and for immigrants community to understand that a lot of the policy and the decision-making process comes within that context. It is important, and that has been a big part of my work.
I don't know that history gets in the way. I think it's politics. I mean, history in a sense is neutral. It happens, right? It's the politics that gets in the way because people, for reasons that are unfathomable, don't want to have integrated education. We've had brilliant African American and Latino and Asian American students educated in under substandard schools. So it's not that you can't do it, but the concentration of poverty, the concentration of lack of resources, the concentration of inadequate opportunities is pervasive. When you put a mirror, you'll see suburban Boston and urban Boston, and they're exactly the opposite, and it's all about resources and race, and we can't ignore that.
The thing that I'm always fascinated about is just how you sort of statistically look at the diversity within the diversity. And Boston Public Schools are now overwhelmingly diverse. According to the school system, the students come from as many as 114 different countries. A 2004 study by the Civil Rights Project at Harvard University found 61% of the black students in the Boston public school system attend schools that are more than 90% non-white. 54% of Latino students in Boston attend schools that are more than 90% non-white. And in case you're wondering where all the white students went, 44% of white students living in Boston attend private schools. Dr. Payson, given this sort of changing demographics, how does that impact the school assignment plan?
The one fear I had about coming to Boston as superintendent was that student assignment would be the all-consuming issue, and I would never get to what is fundamental to changing all of this, and that is focusing on teaching and learning so all students can get a good quality education. Having said that, on 3 different occasions over the 9 years I've been here, we've taken another look at the student assignment system. We did it most recently in this last year. We did it better than we have before, and then we really went out to the community, held a lot of community forums in all different parts of the city in 2 phases, and got a lot of rich information and data back from people. And basically, everybody agreed they wanted quality. What the division was, those who wanted to be guaranteed a seat in their neighborhood school, if they thought that was the best school for their child, wanted that guarantee. And other people didn't want choice limited, because if they didn't want their neighborhood school, they wanted to still have the wide-ranging opportunities of choice. And it's very difficult to bridge those 2 things with an assignment system that will satisfy all. We've made some modifications and changes, but basically we have not cut back on choice, and we have not changed the factor of 50% of the seats being set aside for a walk zone, which is close to the neighborhood, versus 50% of the seats in elementary and middle schools being set aside for people who want to choose from outside of the walk zone.
Let me follow this up by saying, asking, so how do we accommodate this growing immigration population that's coming to the schools?
The first thing people have got to understand is that we don't sort and sift in Boston, in the public schools.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah,
what do you mean by that?
We can't say Tom Payson can't come because he has a disability, or he doesn't have English as a first language, or his English proficiency is there but not quite good enough, or he's a discipline problem, or he acts out in schools. Even when students are expelled in Boston because they violate the discipline code and are put out of school, we provide within the Boston Public Schools an alternative program. That's not required for us to do. All of the other schools that we're talking about, whether they be charter schools, private schools, parochial, they get to do some choosing. And they don't have the final obligation to serve everybody. And people have got to understand that's the beauty of public education and what it's all about. And that's our challenge, and to convince people that we can do that, and we're making progress. We've got a long way to go. But it's got to be a field of dreams mentality. And build it, and they will come. And we're trying to build it.
But charter schools, so we're clear, are public schools. They're open to all the children in the public school system.
They are, but they do not take the same percentage of English language learners or the students with disabilities that are beyond the mild range. And that's...
Well, Dr. Alfred is jumping to get in this one.
Come back to the immigration issue and to the choice questions. On the immigration issue, we have the whole growth of Massachusetts is being driven by international immigration now, and Latinos are the largest minority community, and they're going to be growing very substantially. Unfortunately, Massachusetts has a law that outlaws adequate bilingual instruction and very high level of segregation of students. Most of the Latino students are segregated not in Boston, but in the satellite cities around Boston, which have very inadequate resources. And we have to think about, if this is our growing population, whether we're disabling ourselves in terms of our future labor market and our future talent pool and so forth, the way we're educating. In Boston, an important thing to remember, everybody always shows the picture of the conflict at South Boston with mandatory desegregation, but that hasn't existed since when? 1980. We've had a choice plan, and most people in Boston don't want to go to their neighborhood school, especially the people who are in the neighborhoods that don't have any neighborhood schools, which are mostly minority people, and the people who are in the neighborhood schools that have concentrated poverty and tremendous problems. They want to have a choice to go to better school, and the better schools happen to be schools that are less isolated in those respects.
What do you see, Dr. Burden on those minority communities? Because there were neighborhood schools before busing. Those schools were inadequate. They were all shut down.
Not all of them.
Well, many of them shut down, right? They're gone.
Right.
And then now we've had resegregation, and we don't have the neighborhood schools in those very same neighborhoods.
So some people would get neighborhood schools, and other people would have to be bused, and if they weren't allowed to be bused into the schools that were better, they'd be stuck being bused plus getting a segregated and inadequate school. That's what a lot of the conflict in Boston.
Dr. Clone, what do you find?
It's really interesting to me and to us, not only at Iniciativa but at the Gaston Institute, which is part of the work that part of the organizations that we work with, is that we talk about this immigrant population as being something of novelty, as a recent arrival. Again, it's really important to note that the Latino population and Latino students have been part of Boston Public Schools for many, many years. In 1990, the Latino student population was about 1 in 4. 15 years later, we're now 1 in 3. So yes, there are more Latino students in Boston Public Schools, but the vast majority of Latino students are in regular education programs. Most of them were born in the United States. Yes, we do have a large number of students that are in English language programs. We don't have transitional bilingual programs anymore. The schools are trying hard to meet their needs, and I think that that's a conversation that we need to have. Given the current population that we have in Boston Public Schools, how can schools and communities work together to meet the needs of these students so that student achievement goes up and we can prepare the kids to college and to enter the workforce in large numbers?
Well, speaking of community, I want to get the audience involved. I think we have a question, so the first person that wants to stand and ask a question. Introduce yourself and ask your question.
My name is Miera Levinson. I am an 8th grade civics teacher at the McCormick Middle School. And I was curious, both as a teacher and as a parent of a 2-year-old, and I live in Jamaica Plain, so I'll be thinking about where to send my own kid. I was curious how you would cut the Gordian knot between trying to have socioeconomically diverse, racially and ethnically integrated schools that were neighborhood schools, given the continued segregated character of many of our neighborhoods here in Boston.
Dr. Pazon.
The honest answer is I don't know. The reality is that 78% of the students in the Boston public schools are on free and reduced price lunch. And that may be an undercount. So that gets at the issue of class and resources that families do or do not have. Typically, not because of their own doing, but because of circumstances that they are trying to cope with without the kind of supports that families need in a whole range of areas to better support their kids. So I have to take the position and believe in it that the public schools have got to serve all, and that we've got to improve the quality for all, no matter what the barriers may be. And it doesn't matter anymore to me. I can't use and won't use the excuse if there's not a white child sitting next to a black child and a Latino child and an Asian child in every classroom in some numerical distribution that you can't have good quality schools. We've proved otherwise. We've got existence proofs in Boston. Are we at scale yet? No. But we think we know what to do with the right kind of resources to get there, so whomever walks in the door will be able to get a good education.
Let me respond very quickly, if I can. First, thank you for being a teacher. I think one of the important things that we miss are more young, committed, and diverse people who are willing to go into the classroom, receive clearly substandard pay, and work in very difficult conditions to educate our children. That's very important. But let me say something else, not to you, but to the community that's a part of where you are. I would call it the Brookline community, the Jamaica Plain community, the Cambridge community. The problem is that there still is a perception that if your children are in an environment with those who are dark or who are bilingual, that they're not going to get a quality education, they're not going to get a good experience. And we have to deal with that conscious and unconscious racism where people think that I'm not going to send my child there because they are there. And the fact that the person is poor and black or bilingual has nothing to do with their ability to learn. And we have to have those conversations over Brie and Chardonnay. We have to have those conversations at the book club. We have to have those conversations in our synagogues, our temples, our churches, where segregation is rampant. Because if whites don't understand that our future success as a community, as a nation, depends on diversity, we will never achieve our goals. We love people, we nurture people, we respect each other, we want to learn, we want to be successful. So it really is an appeal. It is an appeal to the white community. Do not be afraid of us. Well, do not fear us, because we are part of the same community that you're from, and I hope you will have that conversation with your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors, because we have to have it. As long as we ignore it, we won't make any progress. So people aren't going to take a chance to move from that zip code out there to this zip code in here, and to show you can still learn in urban America. We've always done it, we will always do it, but we need your help.
It's almost ironic that I'm going to ask this next question, given that this conversation that you're referring to has never really happened. And I'm almost going to ask you, is it time to move beyond black and white and that issue? Dr. Orfield.
Well, I think it is. We need to think about class and poverty as well, because it's very important to have middle-class blacks and Latinos in the Boston's public schools, too. The thing is, in Boston and a number of our older cities now, there's a massive gentrification going on. There's lots of middle-class people moving into the city, and they're not going to the public schools. And we can't get them into the public schools until we have a conscious policy to give college prep level education in those gentrifying neighborhoods, and an explicit integration policy, because families don't want to have their children as the only white child, for example, in a school, even though they're perfectly willing to go to a well-integrated school, as we have many in Cambridge, for example. To get from there to an actual change, you have to have a policy to do it and a plan, and I don't think the Boston Schools has that kind of plan, and does not talk about integration, really. Every school superintendent in the country in a segregated schools system always says we know how to make all those schools equal. Not one, any place, has ever done it on scale. And I think that's a reality that we have to talk about. They've been talking about this same thing for 30 years, every single superintendent that I've ever dealt with, and none of them has actually delivered equal schools. And it's not their fault, they try, but the problems of the concentrated poverty are enormous. In Hartford, Connecticut, where there was a lawsuit about this, we found that in a typical classroom there were 3 kids with developmental disabilities. Most of the kids didn't speak English as their native language. 7 or 8 of the kids had been in a different school the previous year. Many didn't have an affordable place to live. A number of them had teenagers for parents. There were all these problems concentrated in the school, in each classroom, and you know, people say that an act of will can overcome that. And there are individual schools that have done that, but there's no school system that has ever done it on a systemic basis.
Melissa, where do you think the conversation needs to head?
You know, one of, I think it was Mr. Orfield said that the role of parents and the need for parents to be part of their children's education really is a transformative force in all of public schools. So I think that when we really talk about improving public schools, especially when it comes to high minority, high poverty school districts, the idea of having a force of middle class parents, whether they're white, whether they're Latino, whether they're Asian, be part of that public school is amazing. As a former teacher myself, I remember very clearly that it was those middle class parents who were educated and who knew what good public education was like, that advocated for all children to receive a high quality education. So we do need, we do need more middle-class parents that are committed to the public schools in Boston to really change the schools.
Dr. Pisa.
I want to push back on my friend and colleague, Professor Orfield. I agree that nobody's taken it to scale. But the problem with describing things the way you have, which are grounded in research and data, is I will on any day, unannounced, take anybody into any Boston public school. And most people who haven't been near a public school, let alone one in Boston, in lots of years will be absolutely amazed. We had 85 people principal for a day in October from business community, community-based organizations come in, and they were absolutely amazed. It is hard work. We're not there. We have a Why My BPS program to get parents who would not otherwise think about sending their children to Boston Public Schools, and it's a great thing, Ms. Levinson, as a teacher and a parent to do that, to go in and see, and the difference, and what it's like to be in a diverse setting where good instruction is going on and results are improving.
I'd like to give Professor Ogletree another shot at is race and important as class and poverty?
I may be alone. Maybe Ms. Cologne will join me on this. I may be alone in this view about getting beyond black and white. I worry about a serious mistake we've made. And again, it's about politics. And taking away the creativity, the diversity, and the multi-talents of our community, and particularly our students, when we punish people because they're bilingual or multilingual. Seems to me that's a brilliant thing. Someone who has a culture and a language that adds something to a classroom, adds a perspective. Don't speak that. If Ms. Cologne spoke in Spanish now, I bet a third of this audience would understand exactly what she's saying. The irony is that 2/3 wouldn't, because we don't do that in our normal conversation. So it is beyond black and white. And there's another reason it's beyond black and white. All these children are brilliant. We don't see that in the grades they get, but if I said Charles Hampton Houston, they would know who that was. Thurgood Marshall, they might know. Dr. King, a lot would know. If I said Ludacris, they know who that was. And I say that because they understand. They are bilingual. They can understand hip-hop. They know all the words. They know all of that, which means they have an excitement about learning something, Why can't we make the classroom exciting so that people of every language, every diversity can have that experience? That's what I think is lacking, that we are punishing students for being creative and different as opposed to trying to encourage that and give incentives for students who come from another country, come from another land, and would make our American system more rich if we celebrated diversity rather than suppressing all the wonderful cultures and lives and histories that these children, their parents, their grandparents bring. We make a terrible mistake. Call ourselves the United States of America. We're the United States of some parts of America, not all of America, and I'd like to see that change.
Yeah, as we move into the future, we can see that the courts have sort of restrained that kind of diversity.
I thought we were going to leave the courts alone. now you go into the sublime to the ridiculous, right?
In the last part of our discussion, we'll explore the future of diversity in Boston schools by looking at a court case that's happening in another Massachusetts city. The Lynn public school system has had a voluntary desegregation program for the last 17 years. Teachers, administrators, and business people say the program is beneficial to the students and the city. But opponents decry the use of race as a primary factor in promoting diversity. Lynn's plan is now in jeopardy.
The city of Lynn, 11 miles north of Boston, home to 90,000 people. Historically, this was a predominantly white working-class town. But starting in the 1970s, large numbers of racial and ethnic minorities transformed the city. Neighborhoods became segregated and the schools polarized.
There was overcrowding, there was a high rate of absenteeism, there were low test scores. There was also issues with racial tension at some of the high schools, and many of the schools were not prepared to deal with children of so many diverse cultures.
In the late 1980s, the Department of Education pressured Lynn to create a plan, which became officially known as a voluntary plan for school improvement and the elimination of minority isolation.
Fundamentally, it guarantees every student the right to attend their neighborhood schools. But if a parent wants to transfer their child to an out-of-neighborhood school, then the district will look to see whether or not that transfer will have a segregative effect. All the transfers are voluntary. What the plan does is just provide parents more school options.
I see 1, 2, 3, 4 hands up.
The voluntary plan improved diversity in the schools. Many parents, like Karen Horner, were supportive.
Having Jasmine in a well-balanced, integrated environment has benefited her tremendously. She is competitive, right along with all the rest of the children.
I had to act crazy.
She has Latino friends, she has white friends, black friends, Asian friends. Jasmine's getting the benefit of that experience, as well as my other 2 children.
But in 1999, a white parent filed a lawsuit against the school district after her request to transfer her child was denied. She was soon joined by a handful of white, black, and Latino parents.
These plaintiffs all were injured by the program. They wanted to make transfers from their neighborhood school to another school for a variety of reasons, and they were told they couldn't do it because the children were the wrong color.
The school district claimed that the transfer would have a negative effect on school integration. In October 2004, after a series of court battles, a 3-judge panel of the First Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the Lynn plan was unconstitutional.
It was strictly by color that these kids were being given an advantage or a disadvantage in transferring. Only by their color. You cannot do that.
Okay.
The court suggested that the Lynn schools consider a race-neutral plan, shifting their focus to factors such as socioeconomics rather than race.
You can use poverty level, you can use a lot of other socioeconomic factors, but you can't deny the fact that race has to play a part in this, because unless it does, you're not going to be able to racially balance schools.
But a month later, the ruling that found the Lynn plan unconstitutional was vacated. The case is now under review by the entire First Circuit Court of Appeals. Both parties say they will consider taking the case to the U.S. Supreme Court.
As far as children of different races attending a school together and what benefits are received, I don't think they're huge, but I think there are some there. I don't think it's an educational benefit. It's a societal benefit, so they can socialize a little more. And is that desirable? Sure. Is it a compelling state interest? No. And it should not be imposed by a judge.
Race still matters in America, and I think having the children integrate while they're young, they're having those discussions. They may not be talking about race per se, but they're interacting and they're finding out about each other. They're finding out about different cultures.
If the Supreme Court takes this case, it'll be the final word on diversity in the school systems, K through 12.
The issue grows more complicated as the schools become more racially diverse. What new questions will be raised as America moves beyond black and white remain to be seen.
Professor Ogletree, the great defender of the court system, the problem, as I say, is it's a race-based problem, but a race-neutral solution. What can Boston learn from the Lynn experience?
With all respect to Charles Darling, this is not going to be the definitive decision on K through 12 education, because every state is different. The Supreme Court is very careful about cases it selects, but it tells us that we have a problem that seems insolvable, the problem that Brown created 50 years ago. That is, we want an integrated school system and we want quality education. And some people seem to think we can't do both. We can do both. We can have integration and quality. And that's what seems to be the problem. And I applaud these parents who support the idea that from the moment their child has a social experience, it's with someone that's different, so they can appreciate and grow from differences, as opposed to being worried that that somehow is forcing some diversity on them. I hope the First Circuit will agree with Judge Nancy Gertner and uphold the plan. And I hope that the Supreme Court, after the Michigan affirmative action case, will also see the value of diversity in that same way. And I guess I'm optimistic in terms of we will ultimately have both integration and quality education and see them as compatible and not at all in conflict.
I think one thing that's really important about this is, you know, the opposing lawyer said there's no compelling educational benefit.
Wow,
and that's exactly what the Supreme Court said the opposite about in the University of Michigan case.
Right.
They said there is a compelling educational and social benefit and benefit for our democracy from diverse colleges. If that's true for colleges, which only a fraction of people get to experience, how much more important is it for public schools, where you can have this experience? We have lots of evidence to show that students learn not just how to be friendly with each other, but they learn to understand each other's cultures. They need to learn to think in a different way, to consider more perspectives. There's lots of evidence of this, and that statement was just plain wrong.
Absolutely. I completely, reject that statement. And I think one thing that is very interesting about the Lynn case is that the lens is on communities like Lynn, like Revere, like Everett, places that are suburban where the number of students of color are drastically increasing, and they have an opportune situation that they can say we're going to embrace diversity. Diversity is important. The experiences that these particular children bring to the classroom not only add value to the learning experience of others, but it is our responsibility to make sure that all students are receiving a high quality education. And for folks to reject that, I think sends a bad precedent.
And especially considering that the Supreme Court just recently reaffirmed that diversity is a worthwhile goal, just as important as any other academic endeavor. Let's go to our studio audience, and we have a guest, Gene McGuire, director of METCO, an urban suburban desegregation program. Gene.
How can we create a desegregation plan that can withstand constitutional or court challenge?
Lawyer.
Gene, first again, let me congratulate you for almost 40 years of the METCO program. a parent who said, I'm going to take responsibility for my children's education, and I'm going to make sure that they stay in our community where they live, and I'm going to make sure they go to a place to get the best quality education. It is a remarkable accomplishment. And we do that by going back to basic principles. What really, I think, influenced the Supreme Court's thinking in Brown 50 years ago is that they could see the difference between what black children and white children were getting. And it wasn't that the children weren't willing to learn, weren't able to learn, but the differences in the structures, the books, the education was massive. It's ironic, as the Civil Rights Project reports now, that we're seeing those same things again in the 20th century and then the 21st century. And I think we have to present to the Supreme Court compelling, documented evidence that we are resegregating and having, I'm going to call it black and white schools. I mean, there are other colors, but there's a stark difference, number one. And number two, is the Supreme Court going to be satisfied if everyone's getting educated but doing so in a segregated statement? I mean, we're going to go back to Jim Crow. Yep. That's okay, the blacks are okay in their school, the Chicanos are okay in their school, the whites are okay in their schools, Asian Americans are okay in their school. That's not what this country's about. And the Michigan case told it, because the irony of Michigan, a high-quality, extremely elite university and law school, those students, black and white, who came to Michigan had their first integrated experience. That makes no sense. They went to segregated schools in high school. The blacks went to schools with blacks, the whites with whites, because Detroit is a classic example of an urban community that's black, a suburban community that's white, and they were the first time seeing somebody different when they were young adults. That doesn't make any sense in America, in an urban area. And I think we have to compel the court to see the damage it's doing to our children, because I think what we saw with the test 50 years ago with Kenneth and Mamie Clark, where black children were saying they liked the white doll and they didn't like the black doll, that may seem simplistic, but if black children have any level of self-hate, or the images of black are all negative, lazy, stupid, criminal, and white, smart, brilliant, peaceful, that's going to be a real problem in terms of the 21st century. So I think we needed to document brick by brick, neighborhood by neighborhood, district by district, city by city, state by state, the pervasive impact of segregated education. And I think it's not just a court. The court can only do so much. I think this has to be a public referendum on it. Let me just say one other thing, I'm sorry, which is one quick point.
Okay, sure.
And this is it. The whole idea is that we don't have, in America, a fundamental right to public education. You say we do. No, we don't. Our Constitution is silent on that. Other world nations has it, but we don't have it. And if we talk about a constitutional amendment, not about gay marriage or about something else, but how about public quality education? Because why is it important? We have not even talked today about, we talk about urban and suburban America. There's something called rural America. There are a lot of poor white families whose children are not being educated. And a plan that is not based on race, but based on access equally to our children is what we need, and we don't have now. So I think building the case from the bottom, taking our time. It may take 20 years. It's not overnight. It may take 20 years, but I'm telling you that we need to build a case that will convince the court that not only is the right thing, but the right thing to do.
A lot of research that Dr. Orfield has done has documented the impact of desegregation or segregated schools on kids. Now, how do you think they can withstand a court challenge?
Well, the basic problem, as I see it, I'm a political scientist, is that we have our courts staffed increasingly with judges who are hostile. The Chief Justice of the United States was against the Brown decision as a clerk on the Supreme Court. With judges like that, you have a really serious uphill battle. That's why it matters so much who gets appointed to our federal courts. We've been appointing a lot of people who accept and foster segregation and dismantle desegregation and other kinds of civil rights policies. But it seems to me also that the lesson of the University of Michigan case is that all over the country people did document the benefits, and they did create coalitions, and they did explain it to business leaders and military leaders, and people came together in that case, and a very conservative court upheld affirmative action for colleges. We need the same kind of thing for public schools. It's even much more important.
Our next question comes from Samuel Hurtado. Director of the Latino Education Action Network. Mr. Hurtado.
Thank you for taking my question. My question will be for Dr. Paysan. Dr. Paysan, do you see any correlation between more parent participation, parent engagement, and closing the achievement gap? If yes, don't you think that we need more than 35 part-time positions of family and community outreach managers, and that we need more bilingual teachers and administrative staff who will reflect the diversity of our student and parents population in BPS?
Yes, yes, and yes. First of all, on the last question, we have done a much better job in getting a wide range of diverse, high-quality candidates to take the leadership at the school level. Dramatic shift in the last 10 years. We're not making as dramatic progress with respect to teachers. We're still at about 35% to 37% teachers of color, but it is a very, very major goal to keep moving in that direction. Family participation, community participation is critical. The schools can't do it alone. We have to be accountable for our piece. The parents and communities have to be accountable for theirs, and we've got to find a way to bridge the two. The outreach managers are a solid proposal to do so. $7 million to do it across the system in the way it's been proposed, that's not going to happen in this climate with the resources we have, but I've made the commitment to get us started in this budget for the next school year.
Let me throw this question to the panel. How can we have these conversations about diversity without talking about white students? Where and how can we encourage white students to return to Boston Public Schools? I'll put that to Orfield.
Okay. My own children went to Washington, D.C. and Chicago public schools, and they had a very powerful and deep experience. And I think it's very healthy for whites to be in a diverse setting. White students who are in those settings that we've surveyed in Cambridge and Lynn, for example, believe it's improved their education by vast margins. White parents whose children are in integrated schools find them supportive. The segregated housing patterns of Boston are very serious, and we have increasing separation residentially in our metropolitan area. We need to give white parents an opportunity and an invitation to come back into urban public schools. And in doing that, we have to deal with what they're nervous about. White parents, by and large, like integrated schools with significant middle-class populations. They don't like to be the only student of their race in a school that's overwhelmingly poor. And if you can provide a school like that, and if it has a leadership that welcomes them and recruits them as well as others, you can bring people into public schools, and you can bring a lot of energy into those schools. And it's a positive experience for everyone. Whites who are in integrated settings in public schools and in colleges find it very positive. And not only that, but those who do have that experience tend to live and work in integrated settings as adults.
We're almost running out of time, but I want to give each of the panelists a chance to sum up and reflect on what we should take away from this conversation today. Dr. Paysan.
I think we have to be very open to conversations about race and class. The achievement gap is one of our major issues in urban America and in rural, and we have to talk about how to close it, and we're starting to have the conversations, but more importantly, seeing some closing in the gap. I think that the good news is that in a place like Boston, we've got white parents and middle-class Black and Latino parents that are taking another look. And we're doing strategic outreach to these parents and getting them into schools. I could name 12 or 15 schools that nobody would look at 5 or 6 years ago that are now moving towards overchosen. So it can be done, but the schools can't do it alone. It's got to be community, parents, schools, the political will, and we'll get it there.
Brief comments from Melissa.
I think it's very important that our schools and our communities work together. Diversity is a very important part of the education of our students. And we know that the public schools are struggling to close the achievement gap, but it will never be done unless parents, communities, policymakers, educators are at the same table with the same amounts of power to make the decisions necessary to ensure that all children are receiving a high-quality education. And diversity of experiences, nationalities, socioeconomic backgrounds have to be considered when we think about the teams and the educators that are teaching our children.
Professor Ogletree, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I just want to say that to the young people here in particular that don't despair and don't let anyone tell you that your zip code or your school can determine how successful you can be in life. You may know, I went to Harvard, I went to Stanford, I teach at Harvard. Neither of my parents finished high school. Father dropped out in 4th grade, my mother in 10th grade. So if you looked at me 40 years ago, I was a failure. But reading, teachers, and education made it possible. And so don't give up. Don't let anybody take it away from you. Many of you know about the Bell Foundation. We tutor children here, and we have made a distinct difference with children being able to improve a grade each year by the after-school program, the summer program. All of you have the ability to succeed. You will be successful. Don't let anybody turn you around because of your race, your gender, your ethnicity, your diversity. You can succeed, and don't believe the hype. Believe the facts of what you're hearing in class every single day, and you'll make a big difference in this world.
Excellent point. Our challenge as parents, teachers, students, administrators, and activists is to keep having these conversations and to ask the hard questions. I'd like to thank our guests on the panel and our studio audience. I'm Howard Manley for Eye on Education and Basic Black.
For more information, visit the Eye on Education website at wgbh.org/eyeoneducation.